All right, well, Steve, we're going to go ahead and get started here today. I wanted to be conscious of all of your time. I know, ma'am, I know you and Chief got things to do, and so I'm cognizant of the fact we've got a lot of leadership. Nice to see our honorary commanders show up for this event as well. And welcome to really a briefing that is to maybe highlight for all of you an event I would say was one of the understudied events in our history, and talking about Big Week, Operation Argument, which would have wrapped up yesterday, some 80 years ago, in the skies over Europe. But before I get started, I really got to do a shout out to sort of my wingman in this whole thing, Tech Sergeant Jeremy Becknell with the 32nd Air Refueling Squadron, currently with the Wing Staff Agency. He's going to be in the back. You're going to be hearing from him, the second briefer today. So about a year ago, Jeremy gave a presentation to his squadron highlighting its participation in this event, and that's what you're going to hear during the second hour, and for reasons that we're going to get into and hope to quantify here for you today. So Jeremy, right before the new year, said, "Hey, why don't we get together, because it's the 80th anniversary? Why don't we do something for this?" And oh, by the way, overlaid with Masters of the Air being out right now, certainly there was a lot that was sort of a lot of synergy going toward let's do something, and maybe a little bit bigger than normal. So, and hence the presentations that you're going to see today, where as we'll review for the first hour, it'll be myself talking about sort of the background to Big Week and getting into some of the first missions of that event. We'll take a break. Second hour will be Jeremy talking more about the second part of that mission, and one mission in particular on the last day of Big Week. And then we'll take another break, and then the last bit will be a little more free form, a Q&A on Masters of the Air, and hopefully folks have been tuning into that, because there's a lot that you can draw from that program that's really helped our understanding of these events some 80 years ago. But to start, Big Week in context. Up here I put, the important air operation of World War II, and that might sound like a very hyperbolic statement in some ways. I mean, there are many events of World War II that could maybe quantify with such platitudes. But as I will get in today, if you think about what Big Week was designed to do at the time when it fell, especially relative to, I think all of us can agree, to the significance of what the D-Day landings in June of 1944 had in the outcome of World War II. It's hard to really imagine if either that event had failed, and failed due to the Germans' ability to aggress that landing with air power, or something else. I mean, the war would have gone on much longer, greater numbers of casualties. I mean, you can sort of what if the possibilities. But if you sort of think about D-Day and its success being one of the major and probably the most significant events of the fighting of World War II in general, then I think that's where, certainly what were the thesis that we're trying to prove here about Big Week's importance will become plain to you. The other thing that's kind of interesting about it is the fact that it's an event that we really don't talk about all that much in most day-to-day Air Force circles. There could be some reasons for that, mainly since it was a multi-day operation. Individual missions might get a lot of attention, but because there was a bit of it was spread out almost a week, that might have some reason as to why Big Week, we know about it, but we really don't spend much time talking too much about it. And so I already really went over our agenda today. So the first portion will be myself talking about all those things that I already discussed. Jeremy will then come up and talk about that 25 February 44 mission, and there's a special significance to that in the 32nd Air Refueling Squadron, formerly 32nd Bombardment Squadron. We'll kind of wrap up, and then we'll have that last bit on Masters of the Air. Okay, so for the 305th Air Mobility Wing, you can't sort of not go into our spaces there in the wing headquarters, and you'll see this diagram to this event, mission number 115 for the 8th Bomber Command. And if you read the placards that are on the wall in the wing headquarters, you'll read through them and say, well, geez, I mean, why are we highlighting this mission in particular? It sounds like it was about a near disaster. And with all that, I would agree with you. This was a very bad day for the 305th Bombardment Group, our forebears in the current 305th Air Mobility Wing. But I think because it was such a bad day, I mean, it is telling for today's airmen to know what did a bad day in combat really look like. And for our unit in particular, this was the day. But we weren't alone in that. During the second presentation, Jeremy's going to talk about that 25 February 44 mission to Regensburg. The themes are going to sound very similar. Likewise, if you're watching Masters of the Air, episode number 5, the mission to Munster on the 10th of October 1943, when you've got Rosie Rosenthal, his crew, the only one from the group coming back, which is to say that by and large, every bomb group fighting in the European war, whether that was from England with the 8th Air Force or from the groups that were flying from the Med under the 15th Air Force, by and large, every group had a day that was like this, especially in the fall of 1943 when the air war over Europe was not going particularly well for the Allies. We're still trying to prove this thesis of daylight precision bombing, and the Germans are giving us quite the run for our money, trying to prove it and to make it so. So if you sort of keep that in context, I mean, that's one of the reasons why Schweinfurt, maybe more so than some of the actual missions on Big Week, certainly received a lot of attention. And how was that mission supposed to go? And if you take a look at this diagram of kind of the route, leaving from our home airfield of Chelveston, after forming up, pushing into the continent, pretty much a direct shot right to Schweinfurt itself, a little jinking towards the end, and then pretty much a near direct shot back out to England and back home. The key bit is that dotted line that you see represented on this part of the graphic, which was the extreme coverage at that time for the P-47 Thunderbolts, pretty much the escort fighter in the 8th Air Force at that time. And with a single drop tank, that's about as far as they could go to protect the bombers on a given raid. They could pretty much get right to that border of Holland and Germany. And so the rest of that mission, the bombers, were on their own. And if you know from, at least a very cursory reading of 305th history, you'll notice that our first commander, our first designated commander, Colonel Curtis LeMay, when he took command of the group in June of 1942, trained the group up, deployed us in that fall of 1942. We got over there, we started flying missions. We're going to talk a little about the first mission that the 305th was on. But after we got there, and knowing that long-range escorts were still something of the future, LeMay, being a very task-oriented commander, looked at how can we at least find some sort of a tactical innovation that we can make these missions over the European continent survivable. And after having their own experiences of going on missions, not hitting anything, part of the innovations that the Can-Do group came up with was this thing called the combat box formation. That if you can you can have aircraft fly in tight formation, and generally in the early part of the bomber campaign, a group would go out. There were 4 squadrons in the group, but generally would only fly three squadrons at a time of about 6 aircraft, about half the aircraft in the squadron at any one time. So 18 was your number in the early days of the combined bomber offensive. Later they would go up, they would almost double up to 36, especially as German aerial opposition fell off. But if you sort of keep this graphic in mind, what was a combat box supposed to look like, to be successful going into Europe? So you're maximizing your defensive firepower as well as maximizing your massing of your ordnance if you're bombing on the lead bombardier, that your bombs are all being released generally at the same time so that you would get the best saturation and attack your target. So this is what it was supposed to look like. Keep this in mind as we get into when we talk a little bit about the mission timeline. So the day before Schweinfurt, the 13th, the 305th flew a mission. Like so many times in the air war over Europe, it was a weather abort. They came back and without seeing any combat. So they all came back, had their debrief, all right, we were off for that day. But then they get the warning order that evening that a mission is on for the following day, and it's going to be a big one, a maximum effort, as they said at that time, which was you're going to get every aircraft that you can get ready to go on that mission. So interestingly, as it was common, that the commander of the Bomber Command, General Anderson in this case, released a message, kind of it would be somewhat of a little bit of a bravado, or, hey, why are we doing this mission? What is the effect that we intend to have on our enemies? It was released in the clear. And the Germans, being a good thinking enemy that they were, had signals intelligence stations. Obviously they had radar, but this prompted them to know that something was coming the following day. And this was generally the pattern of how 8th Air Force would task the units with a mission. And that those orders then would come out almost midnight. I mean, by this time, all the crews are down, but as we're seeing in Masters of the Air, you had those planners who were working at the group level, working on bomb loads. Obviously, the maintainers were out on the hard stands. They're working all night to get the aircraft ready for what's coming the next day, rearming them, refueling them. In this case, they had, on the 14th, they had, I would almost argue, a kind of a late reveille. For a lot of the missions, especially going deep into Europe, I mean, they'd be waking up at 0300. Generally, that was about the earliest, but maybe an airman coming around, nudging crew awake. Hey, you need to be ready to go here. Get your gear on. Chow in about an hour, and then you're into the briefing for your mission, where you will find out what your target for the day was. Schweinfurt, they had already been there. They knew it was what would probably be called in Vietnam a flak city, heavily defended in terms of anti-air. Of course, they all knew the escorts couldn't take them all the way to the target. So at this point, you can figure that the crew in the briefing, hearing all of this and what their mission was going to look like, was, I'm sure there was a dull, a pit in stomachs, realizing what they were in for today. Immediately after briefing, grabbing gear, crews head out to the aircraft, start engines at 9:50. And their first takeoff at 10:20. Already weather was playing a factor in the outcome of this mission. And we're going to talk a little about the first Schweinfurt mission and how it impacted that. Even if the weather at this point, though, was not good, they had ways of taking off in low light. Generally, in the tail positions of the B-17, they would have a light that they could signal between aircraft, that they would know when each aircraft was going off in sequence. They would take off in 1-minute intervals. And in this case, once they were airborne, they would rally at a predetermined spot to get into the basics of that combat box formation. And this is where the significance of, in our case, the triangle G. In the early days of the air war, and as you see in the series, the first 2 episodes, all you see is a tail code on the B-17. Hard to memorize tail numbers, especially if you're seeing lots of B-17s milling about. You think you know which aircraft are yours, but those tail codes were an MCON procedure to be able to know which aircraft were in your group. So that's one of the reasons why, in our case, we play up the triangle G, which was our units, our letter and our code. But even during this rallying up of aircraft at their predetermined location, the weather is not good. They're generally in there. They've got a grouping together, but at a certain point, they've got to start pointing the nose of their aircraft to the east and start heading into the continent of Europe. So the flight lead that day is a Major Normand, and he sights a combat wing, which a wing at that time was 3 groups. He sees a group up ahead. He thinks that's the 40th Combat Wing. He joins up to it because it's the only one he can observe, and it's a completely different wing. It's the first combat wing. But they've got a gap in their formation. It happens to be the low group, and that's where Norman tucks the 305th in that day. And the low group was always, the low wing was always the least preferred location. Obviously, you're closest to the enemy defenses, and it was usually the first group that the Germans would pick away at and start, straggling out the formation. As it was, even in this attempt to join up with the 1st Combat Wing, albeit it was the wrong unit, they're having to play heavily on the throttles of the aircraft, trying to play catch-up. And for a B-17 that's loaded with bombs and with fuel, they couldn't catch up very quickly. And the jockeying on the throttles to try and catch up meant that this doctrinal combat box was strung out, crossing the channel and going into the continent of Europe. They were assuming risk of dangerous proportions. So then, after somewhat joining the 1st Combat Wing, they're flying into the continent of Europe, and it's about 13:30. Now, the P-47 escorts, because of the weather, were delayed, or I should say, they already took off. They took off in advance of the bombers. So some of the range and some of the legs that they would have supporting the bombers was not there. So that at about 13:30, the escorts had to peel off and go home. That was the max fuel that they had, and they headed right back for home station, because in the day of these aircraft, no such thing as air refueling at this time. You got to go home. And with that, the Germans, about a minute later, fall right in on this straggled formation. In the course of the next 30 minutes, we lose 10 aircraft. 9 actually shot down proper. 1 is crippled. The pilot elects, hey, we're going to scoot, try and at least make neutral Switzerland, try and at least save ourselves if we can. And this then shows the Germans also knew the ranges and knew the parameters of our aircraft, and they knew just when to hit our formations for being, the most vulnerable. And it is just one right after another. So getting back to Masters of the Air, you think about that episode 3. I think it's episode 3, where you see the aircraft. You can see from the tail gunner's position the aircraft in formation and just continually getting picked right off. I mean, I thought that was probably what this moment in time for our unit looked like. I mean, it's just the series has done us a great service that way. They continue on. They start their bomb run about a half an hour later. And at that time, there are only 4 aircraft remaining in this formation of 18 aircraft. One of those is shot down before the city of Schweinfurt, before even releasing their ordnance. At this time, it bombs away. There are only 3 aircraft. 2 are from that medium squadron. 1 is from the high squadron, is the squadron leader. This aircraft from Bullock is already on fire, and it crashes shortly on the other side of Schweinfurt. At which time there are only 2 aircraft that remain, and they return to Charleston later that evening. You can only think about what kind of a day that would have been. Think about your worst day, and we've all been there. We've had bad days, but think about what that effect would be: seeing your fellow aircraft airmen go down en masse. And so, what went wrong this day? Why did this disaster happen? And I will tell you, whoever wanted to read one book on it, George Poole's book, Wrong Place at the Wrong Time. This would be a group veteran who was pretty caustic as to the reasons why that 14th of October day was a particularly bad day. But just to give you some of the cliff notes here. Prompting the Germans that were coming probably would have been one of those techniques that probably would have maybe at least, the Germans didn't know where we're going, but at least gave them the indications and warnings that a mission was on for the following day. Weather, English weather, played havoc more times on more missions, and it was just a function of the environment and the circumstances. It was what it was, and it won't be the last time that happens. Our escorts, a big one, just didn't have the legs to support missions any much further than that at that time. It was sort of the best we could get out of those aircraft that we had available. And the Luftwaffe, at this point, it is a professional organization. It is an integrated anti-air defense, radar. Part of the German, kind of their war-making capability, a heavy part of their war-making capability, is put into anti-aircraft and flak. It is a well-protected, their major cities are well-protected, and their pilots are all veterans of multi-years of combat even before World War II began. So they had a vote. If you made mistakes, they would exploit it and grade your own. But then if you start looking at the leadership, and this gets to some points we've made from time to time, I mean, the folks who are promoted into command, and one of the reasons why commanders in the U.S. Army Air Force were so youthful back then, if you survived and you had any capability, you were promoted. So you take a look at the flight leader that day, Charles Normand. He went through flight training in 1940. He was qualified to fly kind of a twin-engine aircraft called the B-18, kind of a dog, not B-17s. The early part of World War II, he was flying anti-submarine warfare patrols in the Caribbean. And then gets detailed because he has some time in the aircraft. He's sent over, flies his initial missions as a co-pilot, but on his 4th mission, he is signed off as the flying group leader to lead the entire group on combat missions. The day before was the first mission he actually flew as the primary pilot, the left seat, as opposed to the right seat being the co-pilot position. And so Black Thursday then, and you see and you get that feel in this book that a lot of the reasons why, and could Normand have made different decisions, he very well, just as easily could have aborted. I mean, we will probably never know what he was thinking on that mission. Interestingly though, he personally did not suffer for whatever decisions or, the calls he made that day. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel afterwards, got the Silver Star, but you will see his combat flying, his luck kind of played out on a mission to Leipzig in August of '44, and he spent the rest of his days as a prisoner of war. Which really then, I think this comment back and forth between Thomas McGee and Lieutenant Pellegrini was the bombardier in Kane's aircraft. After they get back, he shows up, he asks his bombardier, hey, what happened? Where is everybody? And you can just imagine what's going through Pellegrini's mind at this event. And on the right, you see one of the other aircraft that got back. That was Bullock's aircraft, I believe, that tail number. And you can see the amount of damage to the rudder on that aircraft, no doubt due to German fighter armament. And so really at the end of Second Schweinfurt, there's kind of this reckoning of where we are. So how do we get here? And this is what is going to then lead us to discuss a little bit about. It was sort of the long road then from where we emerged after World War I with the theories of air power. And if you have any discussion about the air power theorists, these are usually the 3 individuals you hear about most. Hugh Trenchard being known as the father of the Royal Air Force. You've got Guillaume Duhay, the command of the air. His treatise on the uses of air power after World War I has been pretty much read and is still read at Maxwell. And then finally our own Billy Mitchell. The advocates that air power operating in that 3rd dimension, it can be a war-winning weapon if we know how to employ it right. It gets resourced properly. And oh, by the way, the primacy of the air weapon really is the strategic aircraft, the strategic bomber, and bombing the industrial centers of your opponent's country. So Billy Mitchell, we all know his story, court-martialed 1925. He leaves the service in 1926, continues on with his, championing of air power, but of course he is helped within the ranks by his apostles who believe that he is on the right path. They're just going to be in positions of influence eventually to be able to affect what he is advocating. And these include Hap Arnold. Late 1930s, he's chief of the Air Corps, later chief of staff of the U.S. Army Air Forces, the leader of the U.S. Army Air Forces all through World War II, believes Mitchell's designs of what air power needs to be. And oh, by the way, if we're going to become an independent Air Force, that will be created around strategic bombing, a truly independent mission for air power. Other apostles include Carl Spaatz, Carl Tui Spaatz, and Ira Eaker, both of whom, for the air refuelers in the crowd, were both on the flight of the Question Mark in 1929. These folks all know each other, continue to have that relationship as they go through their careers. Carl Spaatz is the first commander of 8th Air Force when they get over to England in early 1942. Eaker is initially the 8th Bomber Command, so in charge of all the strategic bombing assets, in England, prosecuting the combined bomber offensive. It's actually his arguments that reigned at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. Churchill would want, once the Americans had thrown with the Brits and bomb only at night. But of course our doctrine, our technology, our aircraft are all predicated on daylight strategic bombing. And they are convinced that is the right way to go, and they're going to do everything they can to make that happen. So these apostles of Mitchell are the ones who are trying to make this all work and learn all those techniques as they come together. And of course, this is also the Holy Writ that is being taught at Maxwell at the Air Corps Tactical School in the interwar period as well. That in that last war, air power could have done more if we didn't have those ground and naval officers kind of tied up with it. It needs to be independent, that the bomber can break the enemy's will, and it is the primary form of air power. Tactical aircraft, fighter aircraft are of secondary importance only. And that, since all great powers are industrial powers, they have critical points. If you target those critical points in those critical industries, that's going to win victory. That is the recipe. And that's what the senior echelons of the U.S. Army Air Corps and later U.S. Army Air Forces believe and are trying to prove. And so it's interesting, if you take a quick snapshot and you look at technology, the evolving technology of aircraft of this time, you see in the 1920s aircraft, generally in terms of their performance and parameters, are about what the aircraft in the Great War, in World War I, what they had, and their speeds and their capabilities. It's still an emerging technology. But what's interesting to note is if you look into the 1930s, we now have all metal low wing cantilever aircraft with more modern and more reliable engines and closed cockpits. But notice at this time, when the Martin B-10 came into the service in the early 1930s, it could pretty much outrun any fighter that was in the U.S. capability at that time. And you look at the pea shooter, you can see the Boeing P-26, you can see why. Still with spatted landing gear. I mean, there's a lot of resistance on that aircraft. So it looked like the whole concept of the bomber being able to outperform the fighter, for a time at least, that looked like that was a true thesis. But if anyone was really taking a look, you can already see by the time we get into the late 1930s, where we are in terms of, if you just do a simple comparison between the early B-17s and the P-40, which was pretty much our leading fighter coming into the U.S. Army Air Corps at that time. You'll notice performance-wise, speed-wise, the fighter has about 50 miles per hour on the bomber at this point. So you think about, in terms of interception, that's a possibility. In some cases, in terms of altitude, the bomber still probably has an advantage. So with these things in mind, that some of these nuances, there's still the prevailing attitude of this role between bomber and fighter and what's predominant. There is still the feeling in the late 30s, on the eve of World War II, that, to quote Stanley Baldwin, the bomber will always get through. That a modern, well-armed bomber is hard for any fighter force or any defender to catch and intercept and to deter. But then we start having early encounters, if you will, early combat. And it's sort of not unlike, thinking about this part of the lecture today, it's not unlike what we're seeing in the Ukraine currently, certainly Ukraine and Russia, what we're seeing with Israel, Hamas. What lessons can we derive from this combat that's currently going on? In the late 1930s, you had this event called the Spanish Civil War going on. The Germans and the Italians were siding with the nationalists, more the fascist-leaning side of the Spanish government, while the Russians were helping the Republicans, the pro-government forces. But even in those early air battles in the Spanish Civil War, there was no clear-cut solution to this whole bomber versus fighter dichotomy. There were times when aircraft and bombers were intercepted, but it was not universal. And a lot of that had to do with some of the material and the aircraft types that were being used by the two sides in combat. There were no clear-cut lessons that could be drawn, at least by all the major air forces, or at least nothing to deter from the thesis that the bomber will not get through. It really took the beginning of World War II then for that to be tested, and to be tested in spades. And interestingly, it happened very soon after the start of the European War. So the British, on the 18th of December 1939, they have built a heavy bomber force in the RAF. Again, this is the pride of Lord Trenchard, and they decided to go after some North German ports on the Baltic, Wilhelmshaven, or at least on the North Sea. And on this day, they dispatch 24 Vickers Wellington bombers, at that time considered their heavy bomber. Obviously unsupported, there were no fighters in the RAF that could get them anywhere near the target. Send them on their own after the naval targets there at Wilhelmshaven. The result is half the force is shot down and destroyed. You see the picture there, that's number 9 Squadron RAF. Of the 16 airmen in that photograph, 14 of them are killed on that single day. The British look at this event, and for them, they conclude, going during the day is suicide. We're not going to do that. They turn almost immediately to night bombing. Not that they can hit anything, and that's going to be the next problem, or at least find the target. The initial British attempts to hit anything from a non-coastal target, they're only getting about 2 or 3 bombs anywhere near a target in their early attempts to attack German cities and targets. And this is one of the reasons all these problems of navigation and target identification is what caused the Brits then. Well, you know what? We're not going to be precise. We're going to target everything. And that's where they go to night area bombing as their thesis on how they're going to use the air arm to a decisive effect. Interestingly, the Battle of Britain, that happens about a year later. German aircraft are regularly being intercepted by the RAF. The Germans suffer, and the Luftwaffe suffers heavy losses at the hands of a determined fighter force that is radar directed in terms of the British defenses. But I think most air forces in the U.S., senior leaders in the U.S. Army Air Forces at the time kind of see this as, but the Germans do it doctrinally different. It's a tactical air force trying to do a strategic mission. It's unsuited for it. Their aircraft aren't nearly as well protected as ours. I think while some of the lessons that could have been taken from the Battle of Britain are at least there in some minds, maybe in the case of the European air forces, the U.S. air chiefs don't yet see this being applicable to them. So then what happens in the intervening time? So we, obviously we get into the war, December 7, 1941. We enter. 8th Air Force is formed in January of 1942, and we begin that buildup of aircraft and personnel in England. And so that by August of 1942, the 8th Air Force flies its first combat mission. It flies a mission to Rouen, France, with only 12 aircraft. But that date being the 17th of August will feature into our story again. We're going to talk about that and how that comes up. Also, it's mentioned in Masters of the Air. That was the only effort, but it was at least the initial effort of what we could produce with our current bombers and current force structure in England at the time. So what begins in the fall of 1942 then is the 8th Air Force and the 8th Bomber Command trying to put the TTPs of this method of warfare together. And that's where the 305th's first combat mission on the 17th of November 42 is somewhat, it kind of illustrates well how these initial missions on the part of the 8th Air Force were going. So mission number 20, and that is the elapsed number of missions that the 8th Bomber Command has flown to date, but going after the U-boat pens at St. Nazaire. So we're hitting a coastal target, we're hitting a naval target. Once again, in the next slide I'll tell you why that was important. And because we were a new bomb group on our first mission, we weren't going to go after the main target. We were going to go after a diversionary target, but just in a way to kind of build up our experience in flying these types of missions. We're going to get maybe a softer challenge, for that first one out. But led personally by LeMay. And that was also a characteristic of his leadership, that he didn't have to fly every mission, but for the important ones, LeMay was usually in that right seat in the lead aircraft, watching it and observing it directly. But these early missions of the 8th Air Force were what they considered what they called a shallow incursion. You're not going very far into occupied airspace. Keep it light. There would be some potential for some escort, at least from the RAF in the early days. But we're not going to go very deep, and that was also to, hey, let's train up, let's figure out how to fly these missions, and let's go so that we're not going to fly into the teeth of the German defenses. And at this point, all the missions in the early days were all really focused on whatever the air power could do to help the Battle of the Atlantic, which was in full swing. The Germans, with their U-boats, are trying to stifle England into submission. They're trying to prevent the Allies from building up units and manpower and personnel for what they know eventually will be a landing on the continent. They're trying to prevent the Allies from doing that. Likewise, we're trying to deter the Germans from being able to maximize the effect of the U-boat arm against our shipping coming across the Atlantic. It's interesting about these U-boat pens, and if you remember, if you've seen 12 O'Clock High, it's like the first discussion that happens when they walk into General Savage's office in the beginning and talking about the U-boat pens. We're just not getting hits on them. But I will tell you, that said, you could get direct hits on U-boat pens with ordnance that was in use at that time and just not make a dent at it. In fact, they were so well built that in many cases, in these coastal ports, they're still there because they're just so hard to knock down. But at the time, we really didn't know that. We're going to do what we can to win, that priority at the time. And so how did that whole mission unfold on that date? So, one group never even found the target because of a navigation error. So it never even got into it. One target, a supporting target from the B-24 group, target was obscured and not bombed. And this we saw in episode 2, and it was, I think, sort of like to paint the picture of, you sort of get the outrage of the crew. Well, what do you mean we're not going to bomb? And they sort of, the way Masters of the Air makes it seem like the CO made kind of a bad call, Colonel Hugland, and we'll get into, and we'll talk a little bit about him a little bit later. But, I mean, that was pretty much the standard of the SOP at the time. If the target was obscured, we weren't going to just bomb randomly. Later in the war, once we got radar into our aircraft, we got a British system called the H-2X. It would usually put, one, what they call a Mickey ship, a radar ship in the lead formation of each squadron, and they would bomb on radar. And it was what was known as blind bombing. It was indiscriminate, it was not precise. But we have not yet at this point gotten to that point where that's something that we're going to do, and that's what you see also demonstrated in Masters as well. So if you take a look at the mission, it was considered a good mission with regard to the fact that we didn't really lose much, and we didn't lose any aircraft. We had one airman killed, granted tragic, but I mean for a mission that was considered good. The 305th, we had all of our aircraft come home. So, okay, it was a training run and it worked out well for us. However, on the bad side, we didn't hit anything. The target wasn't hit, and it was not the first time that we would make a trip back to Saint Nazaire. In fact, here's a picture. You can tell, taken at higher altitude, that U-boat pen is somewhere in this obscured in all the smoke. I would say that was actually for a bomb group flying a proper formation. That was actually a good pattern in terms of hitting the target with a couple of like stragglers here and there. But that was a target that we hit multiple times, in this case just not knowing how much ordnance would it take to try and bring one of these targets down. So that was our first time out. So what happens after that? We continue to build up aircraft, build up bases, more aircraft, more personnel to make a more sustained effort in this campaign. Which really then brings us to the mission again that's sort of captured in Masters of the Air, episode number 3, the whole Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. So this was the first real opportunity on the parts of the air chiefs to see if we could make this pre-war doctrine work. Everything that was encased in that pre-war war plan, air war planning document number 1, Let's go after those, a vital industrial target. And oh, by the way, we think that thing is the ball bearing. If we wipe out the Germans, or it can attrit their ability to make the ball bearing, it's going to have an impact on their armaments industry. They won't be able to make the weapons that they need to fight us. And this is where I think the show really sort of demonstrates well the general outline of how that mission came off. There were two task forces that were tasked that day. The Regensburg task force, of which the 100th was a part of that group. They were going to be part of a shuttle task force, take off first, fly across Germany, they're the green line, and then shuttle, they would land and recover in bases in North Africa. The idea being that the Germans would attack that force, and with about a 30-minute separation between the task forces, as originally intended, that the second task force going after Schweinfurt could fly in, and maybe on their way home they might have to fight their way out. But that they could attack, if they attacked in close, kind of a close sequencing of the aerial attacks, that the Germans won't be able to hit them multiple times. That at least was the idea. And recall that a year prior, they could send 12 aircraft after a single target that was relatively shallow in Europe. Now we're up to almost 400 aircraft going after a target that's really in the heart of Germany. So after a year, this is what they're capable of doing. And once again, the show shows this very well. The impact of English weather, which almost from the outset knocked the wheels off of this great concept, this great idea. Interestingly, LeMay, in charge of the 3rd Air Division, had trained his division to be able to take off in low light, and that's one of the reasons why they pressed and went. They got hit on the way into the target, but he was amazed at the fact that there was actually, the German aerial opposition was less than he expected. They had some fighter escort, but again, it was all short leg. It couldn't take them all the way to the target. The Schweinfurt Task Force, what you don't see in Masters of the Air, where the 305th flew that day, because there was a separation of multiple hours, the Germans were able to hit the Regensburg Task Force, fly home, regroup, bring more fighters on station, realizing, oh wait, here's the main effort coming, hit the Schweinfurt Task Force on the way in, ground, refuel, and hit them again on the way out. So that task force took far higher losses than the Regensburg, not far, but some substantially higher losses than the initial task force going in. On the good note, they did hit the target. And they decreased, as you see, by about a third the German capacity to build ball bearings. It's sort of like if only we had known. And later, after the war, the German Armaments Minister, Albert Speer, said that if he had been able to follow that up with a couple more missions like that, we would have been wiped out in terms of making this product for our war munitions. We just didn't know, and especially once you've taken losses of 60 aircraft with over 500 airmen killed, wounded, taken prisoner, you just couldn't keep going at this. We just didn't have the ability to reconnoiter that quickly. I really think, getting back to Masters, I think they really do a great job of demonstrating that mission, though. Again, they show only one side of the task force. Which again sort of brings us to the fact that between the two Schweinfurt missions in that fall of 1943, we had lost aerial superiority over the continent of Europe. We're at not at a standstill, but we're at a reckoning point of, by this time it's that myth of the bomber will always get through. That myth finally died a very painful and bloody death. And it's really at this point then, we come back, we regroup, and a couple things happen in the intervening time. So interestingly, Eaker was a fighter guy by trade, knew the capabilities of fighters, was always trying to push to get greater escorts, was trying to, a problem, believe it or not, was getting the number and the correct types of drop tanks, having them made in England. They were exploring all possibilities. In some cases, we were making them out of pressed paper, trying to get that capability for our fighters to give them more range. But by the late fall of 1943, Hap Arnold, despite the fact that they were close, Arnold was something of a mentor to Eaker. in some ways, Eaker, I think, got sort of painted with the brush of some of these failures that had happened and the losses that they had taken that fall. And oh, by the way, we're starting to gear up for this D-Day event. And of course, late 1943, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's in the Mediterranean, is tasked with being the Supreme Allied Commander. And he gets ready to move his team back to England to assume control and start planning that event. And while he was in the Med, his chief airman, Jimmy Doolittle, who needs no introduction, famed air racing pilot from the 1920s and 30s, one of the first to get a PhD in aeronautical engineering from MIT. Obviously, the raid that bears his name in the Pacific War in April of 1942, that sees him promoted to 1 star. Initially, Eisenhower didn't necessarily like Doolittle. Was unsure of his skills. He was a reserve officer. Thought he flew a little too much. But by the end of that time, they had built up a relationship that Eisenhower wanted his airmen to plan the air operations for the coming D-Day landings. And in that case, Ira Eaker was shifted down to the Mediterranean to take over the air forces in that theater, while Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. And with Doolittle, I think, came a change in attitude as they went into January of 1944. They were starting to get more fighters in. They were starting to get more and more fighters like the P-51. We finally have an aircraft with the legs that can escort our aircraft all the way to the target and back. They start having an effect. In fact, why I brought that model, that P-51, it's in January of 1944, in a mission to Oschersleben, Germany, to the Focke-Wulf factories, on a mission that they're escorted by the 353rd Fighter Group, Fighter Squadron, commanded by Major Jimmy Howard. And because the other escorts, because of more bad weather, it turns out that him and his wingman are escorting a formation of aircraft. They wade into a large formation of attacking German fighters, and he and his wingman fend them off almost single-handedly. Jimmy Howard becomes the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the Medal of Honor, in his aircraft named Ding Hao. So that's just prior to this event, and I think what that highlights is the fact that American fighters are starting to become a presence. But Doolittle's directive is quite clear when he comes in, and that is that we're going to lock horn, we're going to engage the Luftwaffe, we're going to win the air war to achieve success in the battlefield, and that's the order that his airmen then are charged with in the new direction that comes. And with that comes then the test. We need to have an operation that targets German aircraft industry in particular. The air chiefs come up with what would then be a combined effort against the German armament industry with the RAF, a day and night operation, with almost the main sort of point of this. We're going to use the bombers to go after their industry. That's going to elicit a response from the Luftwaffe, and now with greater numbers of escorts, our escorts will then attack and destroy the Luftwaffe. So we've changed the equation. We're using now the bomber as being the primary instrument of winning the air war. It becomes the bait to then allow the fighters to win air combat over the continent of Europe. And it's kind of interesting. So if you take a look, and I drew this line here, what you see, we're right at the point where your Thunderbolts, this is about the max range that they had into Germany with drop tanks. And during that January-February time, the P-51 without drop tanks can get them a little bit further. But then as more drop tanks come in, into March and April 1942, they have coverage over Berlin, pretty much to the eastern side of Germany itself. And in that is a game changer. So what they plan then is multi-day strikes against the different German aircraft industries you see located down up in northern Germany, through the center part of Germany, and then down south, with an added component now of adding in the 15th Air Force, flying from Italy, attacking some of those same targets. And now with formations that have at least appropriate escort to the mission that they've been handed. And the first day of that event, the 20th of February, is when a young Alabaman from Leeds, Alabama, comes to the fore and flies the mission that makes him famous. It probably didn't want to fame quite in this way. William Lawley, he was known by WR. I think that was kind of his nickname growing up. He had gone through flight training about, only a couple years before this. He gets over to Europe. He's assigned to the 364th Bombardment Squadron of the 305th Bomb Group. And that 20th of February mission was his 10th mission, in theater. And this is a picture of his crew called Cabin in the Sky. So why we remember Lawley is because he was the first of our two Medal of Honor recipients, both of whom interestingly survived the war, which is pretty rare for that decoration. But rather than reading his citation in particular, Edward Jablonski's book on the B-17 from about 1965, still kind of a golden oldie. I think maybe a little better than a citation. I think he describes well what Lawley went through on that date. So if you permit me to kind of read this passage. On the opening day, February 20th, 21 heavy bombers were lost of the approximately 1,000 in the striking force. One of the fortresses that did return from the day's strike on Leipzig was piloted by William R. Lawley, Jr. of Leeds, Alabama. As his B-17 approached the bomb release line, Lawley could be thankful that the flak was light and inaccurate, and even the fighters seemed to remain at a respectful distance. But Lawley's troubles began at the moment of bombs away, for Bombardier Harry G. Mason informed him that for some reason their bombs had not dropped when he released the switch. At practically that same instance, a dozen or more German fighters careened in for the attack, and the fortress recoiled under the weight of heavy cannon fire. A 20-millimeter cannon shell burst inside the cockpit, killing his co-pilot instantly and wounding Lawley. He then heard Mason report that the engine was aflame. The weight of the co-pilot's body against the control column threw the plane into a dive. And because the blood that had covered the instruments in the windshield, Lawley could neither see out of his plane or read his instruments for a time. While Mason fought to get rid of the bomb load, which made the control of the crippled aircraft even more difficult, Lawley, though seriously wounded, and he was aware, fought with his waning strength to get his fortress under control. He ordered the crew to bail out, only to learn that, including himself, 8 were wounded, and 2 so seriously that they were unable to jump. He would have to remain with the ship. He punched the extinguisher button and the flaming engine stopped burning, and Lawley found that he could relax a little. But just then another engine caught fire as another swarm of fighters piled on the crippled fortress. While the wounded gunners continued fighting the Germans, Lawley managed to get the second fire under control, and Mason succeeded in salvoing the bombs. The bombardier came into the cockpit and saw that Lawley was on the verge of collapse because of his wounds and the exertion of flying the aircraft. That he had remained conscious as long as he did was a miracle, but he slipped into a painful oblivion when he saw Mason was there to help. Mason had been a pilot in training before he was transferred into bombardier training, and he was able to keep their B-17 pointed toward England. As quickly as he spotted a fighter base, Mason managed to bring Lawley back to consciousness. The pilot, making a great effort, kept himself conscious by sheer willpower as he took over the controls. As they approached, an engine ran out of gas and another burst into flame, and they could not lower the landing gear. Lawley fought the fortress in a wheels-up landing. Sparks flashed as the belly of the fortress scraped the concrete and careened into the grass. The propellers were rather neatly bent back and the plane skidded to a stop. Fires were quickly extinguished and ambulances rushed the wounded to the hospital. For his part on the Leipzig mission, Lawley was awarded the Medal of Honor, and Mason and his radio operator, T.A. Dempsey, were decorated with the Silver Star. Dempsey administered to the wounded crew members, and manned the guns with the most seriously wounded men. So it's interesting. I think if you go back to like the old, 12 o'clock high I mentioned earlier, that opening sequence with this Lieutenant Bishop, kind of bringing in an aircraft, and then you read that citation, or at least the broad brush of Lawley's actions. I mean, there's kind of a lot in common. You can see where they got inspiration for probably that part of the movie. Interestingly, there were also other aircraft that had similar problems. In one case, you had another B-17 with both the pilot and the co-pilot badly wounded, where a gunner, an enlisted gunner, and a bombardier tried to bring the aircraft in for a landing. They couldn't do it, and both were killed, trying to effect that. So, the story of Sergeant Matthews and First Lieutenant Trumper were two other medals of honor that were awarded for crews on just that first day of Big. And that would then become like the first day of this multi-day operation. And it's interesting, on the following day, on the 22nd of February, there was another aircraft, another 364th Bombardment Squadron, B-17, on its way back. It was crippled, 2 engines out, called Mi Amigo, and had come back from Europe, had crossed over into northern England, and it was making its way back south to Chelveston. The pilot and the crew tried to put it down into a field by Sheffield, England, farther to the north. And as the pilot let down, he noticed and saw that there were English kids playing games in this wide open field. At the last minute, he turned off, but unfortunately, by doing that, lost control of the aircraft. It crashed. Everyone aboard was killed. And what's interesting for us, last year, when we went on our Chelveston Heritage trip, as we were standing there looking at and recounting some of those buried at the American Cemetery there in Mattingly, a gentleman came walking up, and it turns out that he was one of the English kids who were playing in that field, and he was there to represent and honor the loss of, again, one of our 305th aircraft, Mi Amigo. So talk about, the sacrifice of our airmen on this day. Which then, folks, pretty much brings me to the end of my portion. With that, are there any questions? At this point, at least what I've covered so far.
Sir. Lieutenant Colonel Hanson, do you think, was the broadcasting the orders in the clear, was that standard, or were they in a hurry to get things out, or what was that?
I suspect that it probably was a hurried, that was not the standard SOP. I think there was a mistake, with the communications of the 8th Bomber Wing. The fact that this was addressed in the clear, was an issue that, to my knowledge, they didn't subsequently, continue making that same mistake. That said, if the weather was at least there was any possibility of decent weather, and the Germans knew this too, they could read weather reports just as well as the Allies could. And of course, once the aircraft took off from their airfield, if there was any possibility of there being a mission that was coming their way that day, radar could pick up the aircraft while they're still over English airspace in many cases. So they knew in many cases that a mission was coming. I think the value of them transmitting in the clear the night before, that just gave me a couple hours more of heads up in the morning.
Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Great question.
Welcome back to part 2. We're going to talk about a distinguished unit citation earned by the 301st Bomber Group on the last FA week. A lot of this is going to play very similar to Schweinfurt for similar reasons, but in the end, we did go through, and then we'll talk about the end of Big Week and how we won it, and then we'll open up for questions. So first, start off with a real quick intro on the 301st. They're activated on 3 February 1942 with 4 squadrons. The 32nd, my old squadron, 352nd, 353rd, and the 419th. They are the second squadron, or the second bomber to reach England, just behind the 97th. They stay at Chelveston from August to November of 42, flying some of those very first missions that Mr. Lockhart talked about. Then when the invasion of North Africa happens, they and the 97th, being the 2 most experienced bomb groups, are sent down to North Africa. where they're going to spend about the next year hopping from base to base across the deserts of North Africa. So they didn't get the idyllic English weather and populace to live amongst while they're flying their missions. Sometimes they are at built-up airfields, other times they're living in tents. Now from there, at the end of December of 43, they move into southern Italy, where they're going to spend the rest of the war in what was called the Foggia Airfield Complex. Now this was basically the same thing as East Anglia. It was a large flat area, about the only large flat area in Italy that was in Allied hands at the time, and it was peppered with airfields. And the one in blue is where the 301st bedded down between the cities of Foggia and Lucera. And so from there, kind of set the place, and we're going to go ahead and start talking about the mission. Very similar thing happens. The day before, the operator drops from the wing, or from the 15th Air Force down to the wing, sets our target of the Regensburg Proof-Ning Messerschmitt Aircraft Factory. It's one of 2 Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg, and the forces that day are going to be split going between the 2. 15th Air Force is going to send 5 wings, or from the 5th wing, 4 groups of B-17s to hit at H+4. The 47th wing is going to send 5 groups of B-24s, and a few minutes later, and their escort, again, P-47 short legs, they're going to pick up P-47s from the 325th on the exfil. And the 8th Air Force, since this is Big Week, it's a combined operation. The 3rd Air Division is going to send 3 groups to this factory in Regensburg, and the rest of the division is going to hit a factory on the other side of town. And this actually includes the 100th. So you see this in Masters of the Air. Not this raid in particular, but you do see the target. So we drill down from the wing to the group. It splits it out a little bit further. Sets our takeoff time is 9 a.m. They're going to rendezvous over the city of Foggia about 30 minutes after again. Everybody's taking off, building in formation before they start to press on to the target. Their first nav point is going to be Volkermark in Austria. They're going to climb up to about 24,000 feet en route. Turn to the IP, hit the IP, come to a heading of 005, and hit the target at H+4. The plan is to be flying 155 miles an hour, stacked from 23,000 to 24,200 feet, and each plane is going to be carrying 12 500-pound bombs. After that, they're going to make a left turn to the rally point, and rally back up, and press home, catching their fighter escort over Austria, and for a total flying distance of about 1,100 miles. So there's our plan. Take a look at our target. Here we see 2 pictures of the factory complex. You see the factory out there in the rectangle with the airfield next to it. And the other image is actually from episode 3 of Masters of the Air, when they're depicting the Schweinberg-Regensburg mission. So you can see the airfield. If you look a little bit closer, you can actually see a sports field, and the road network depicted in the show is pretty accurate. So it's one of the things that, this is the part that sold me in the show, because I had my doubts to begin with. But when I saw this, I literally gasped. I've studied this mission. But the factory that we're hitting is in the Proof-Ning neighborhood of Regensburg. It's a Messerschmitt Work 1. It was built between 1936 and 1937, and in 1939 starts producing BF-109s. This is the Germans' main single-engine fighter, and this is one of the main production centers for it. They start out in 1939 building 144, and in 1943 they were able to crank out about 2,100. It's hit numerous times. Again, we see it in episode 3. At the beginning of Big Week, there's an attack, and there's a second attempt on the 22nd, which ends up being a weather divert. So they miss one, but we're going to go back there on the 25th. Again, like Mr. Lockhart mentioned, the Germans aren't stupid. They defend these things. They know they're important. And around the city of Regensburg, they have 11 batteries of 88s. Typically, it's 4 guns per battery, so you're looking at about 44 guns. It fires a 20-pound shell, like this, up to a max effective ceiling about 26,000 feet. Maxes out at about 30,000 feet. Each gun has rate of fire, you see there, about 15, 20 rounds per minute, meaning if the entire battery is firing, they are putting up 14 rounds per second. And that's a lot of metal flying in the air. So, senior mission, senior target, we just look at our players. Some of us will be familiar with the B-17. Here's its specs. For the time, it's a pretty big airplane, but again, this is also designed in the early 1930s. So by this time, almost 10 years later, it's about seeing the zenith of its production. It's already being outclassed by other aircraft like the B-24 and the B-29, but it's what we have, and you fight wars with what you have. Now it's armed with 13 50 cal machine guns, which gave it its name of the Flying Fortress. Again, 50 cal, it's not a small bullet. We've all seen these. They're not small, and it spits out a lot of them. So there's that, and just a quick rundown of crew positions from nose to tail. In the nose, you got the bombardier in the nav, 2 pilots and the flight engineer in the cockpit. Radio operator gets his own compartment. Then you got the ball turret gunner, the 2 waist gunners, and the tail gunner. So losing one of those is a costly toll. The Germans, on the other hand, are going to be meeting us with fighters. And their main single-engine fighter is the Bf-109. This version that was in production at the time was armed with 3 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns. So 20mm, a little bit bigger than a 50. The important difference is the 20mm fires an explosive round, whereas the 50 is either solid metal, maybe it's got an armor-piercing core or an incendiary component in it to maybe start a fire. Whereas the 20mm is fused, and when it hits, it explodes. And these are some of the units involved, and actually the aircraft that's pictured is from JG-27 of about the time of the mission, so that's exactly what our foes would have looked like. Additionally, they flew Bf-110s, which is a heavy twin-engine fighter. Developed early in the war. It was initially designed to go out by itself. They very quickly learned that it could not. So by this time, it's relegated to intercepting bombers. It's being a heavy fighter, it's very heavily armed. These have 4 of the 20mm cannons, 2 30mm cannons, and 4 21cm or about 8-inch air-to-air rockets. The air-to-air rockets fire a warhead that's about 90 pounds. They are set to explode at a distance, so these are a standoff weapon. The tactic is pretty much the 110s to get behind the formation, out of range of the gunners, and start lobbing the rockets in. And these had about a lethal radius of about 100 feet. The 30mm, on the other hand, was a pretty fearsome cannon round, much bigger, even more than the 20mm. Its only real use is against bombers because it's a very slow, very heavy round. So using it in a dogfight is a waste. And the Germans called it the melon tosser. It pretty much has the same arc as you tossing a watermelon across the room. Interestingly, it actually has less explosives in it than a grenade. Our standard pineapple grenade had about 60 grams of explosive in it. The 30mm Mark 108 had about 80. Post-war testing showed that for a fighter aircraft, if you get 1 round of that into the fuselage, the aircraft's going to burn. For a large bomber, you're lucky if you survive 2 or 3 hits in a vital area. And again, they did testing after the war on U.S. planes, and it was pretty eye-opening. So these guys are in for a hell of a fight. Again, a couple of units involved, destroyer groups 1 and 76. The aircraft pictured was from ZG-76 at about the time of the mission. And you can actually see the rockets in the tubes under the wing. So there's who's playing, and let's take a look and see at the mission that these guys are going to have to go against. So 9 a.m., 31 B-17s launch from the airfield between Belgium and Lechero. And they're going against the target deep in the industrial heart of Germany. And this is all from, the quotes are all going to be from their proposed unit citation. It's pretty eye-opening read. But the breakout is 8 planes from the 32nd, 7 each from the 352nd and 353rd, and 9 from the 419th. Of those, there's 10 early returns, 8 for weather, and 2 maintenance cancels. The weather, you get separated from your group, you're not going alone. That's a death sentence. You're going to turn around and you're going to come back. And that leaves 21 to press onto the target. And there's the crew breakout there. So as they're flying their route, go over the Adriatic, they coast in to what was then Yugoslavia, near Febuary. And it's from there they start seeing opposition. You see about 50 single-engine fighters coming from the direction of Via Orba in northeastern Italy, and it's gaining on from here. The fight begins about 300 miles from the target. They note in the mission paperwork that 2 stragglers from the lead group are hit first, both going down in flames, and then the fighters regroup a little bit, and then they turn their sights on the 301st. So it's gonna be a hell of a fight. These guys are already past their escort. Well, they don't have escorts on the way out, so they're on their own. They're gonna end up seeing in excess of 200 Luftwaffe fighters going after them. And this is gonna be about a 2-hour running gunfight. There's notes saying that at times there's 20 fighters attacking a squadron at once. Some of the fighters don't break off their attacks until inside 100 yards. Some of the fighters even blast through the formations. They note that there's bombs towed on cables through the formation by flames flying over the groups. There's bombs being dropped through the formation. And one of the planes that goes down was noted to have lost its nose. The glass nose was knocked off by one of these bombs before it goes down. And they also make note of just constant rocket fire from the 110s that are harassing them. And like Mr. Lockhart said, one group comes in, they get their shots off, they peel off, they tag team, and Luftwaffe just has a field day. And most of the fight, or the worst of it, is actually in this rectangle here, between the cities of Klagenfurt and Salzburg over the Austrian Alps. And from here, it gets pretty rough. 32nd loses 4 aircraft. The Epps crew is one of the first ones hit. They get 2 engines knocked out. They drop out of formation, but the crew is able to bail out, but the aircraft is then seen to go into a spin and then explode. Burner's crew, they're one of the first ones hit. When they are, their flight engineer is killed, and one of the gunners is wounded. Bailout orders called, but with the damage, we don't know, but likely the bailout alarm was knocked out in the first hit because, only the co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier were able to escape. Now, Lieutenant Walker's crew has their number 4 engine set on fire just after their tail gunner was heard to scream out on the airphone that he'd been hit. Shortly after, they're going to give the bailout order. When they do, some of the crew back in the waist section go back to check on the tail gunner, Sergeant William Kindle. He is very graphically dead. His head's been blown off. So he goes down with the plane. The rest of the crew is able to get out. In a twist of fate, last summer, actually, as I was on my way back from KC-46 training, Mr. Lockhart notified me that Sergeant Kindle's remains had been identified. And there was going to be a funeral for him in September. I was very fortunate to be selected by the 32nd to represent the 32nd at his funeral and meet his family, including his son. It was quite a moving thing. And then the final plane from the 32nd to go down was flown by Lieutenant Paxton. They're hit by 6 fighters, and the entire airplane from the radio room aft becomes an inferno. The guys in the front, they start going out, but and one guy is seen coming out of the bomb bay with his clothes on fire. And when he opens his parachute catches fire. The co-pilot Nav and Eddie were able to make it out. 352nd gets off a little easy, only losing 1 today. And that's flown by Lieutenant Van Nortwick. They leave the formation about 60 miles north of Klagenfurt with their number 1 and number 4 on fire. They set the autopilot and everyone's able to escape. The 353rd has the worst of it today. So their 5 planes pressed onto the target and none of them make it home. A plane flown by Lieutenant Snyder is hit, has its oxygen system and number 3 engine knocked out. Engine catches fire, They go into a dive, and everyone except the two pilots and the flight engineer think the plane's going down. And they all bail out, but again, their comms were obviously knocked out. But the two pilots and the engineer actually bring the plane home. They're the first one to land back at Fallujah. And it's noted that their plane is basically a flying scrap heap. Lieutenant Hurley, again, tail gunner is killed in his turret. Bombardiers last seen crumpled up against the nose of the airplane, unconscious. Pilot gets a bailout order, but again, just nav, engineer, and radar operator, waist gunner escape as the airplane's going into a spin. Lieutenant Rose, they go down pretty early near Klagenfurt with their number 3 engine on fire. And it does note that everyone gets out, but their co-pilot was knocked unconscious by fragments hitting his helmet. And the helmet right here, it is one of these. So we started out the war, flying with just our crushers. Then they quickly realized that okay, there's a lot of metal flying in the air, so they actually get infantry ground helmets, which are a stopgap where they develop these that have cutouts for our headsets. And also in 43, body armor becomes a thing. The English actually develop it, and they start making it, and by this time in 1944, it's widespread in use. And it's credited with a 70% reduction in crew losses. Of the people that are wounded today, only one person is noted by being wounded by flak. And the flak vest saves many lives. And they're also having to deal with this unconscious pilot and clipping his parachute onto his harness and then dragging him out of the cockpit into the bomb bay where they're able to drop him out of the plane so he can survive. If you've ever been in a B-17, it's not a small space, or it's not a big space to begin with. And then you add in all the flight equipment that's actually there that you don't see in the touring planes. And I don't know how they did it. And then Lieutenant Pierce, very similar story. They go down near the target. Their Baltar gunner is killed in the same attack that takes out one of their waist gunners. Radio operator fills in for one of the waist gunners. He's wounded, and the rest of the crew is able actually to get out, and they're still under attack while they're bailing. Captain Kisselberg, he's the group leader. They go down, again near the target. The radio operator is killed by 20 mil fire. They also have a photographer on board. He's killed. And the Baltar gunner has already run out of ammunition by this point. And he volunteered to stay in his turret and keep spinning the guns to point at the oncoming fighters in hopes of dissuading them, maybe scare them off. But when the bailout order was given, we see this in Masters of the Air, the waist gunners try to get him out of the turret, and they can't. So they have to leave him in the turret as they bail out. Everyone except the radio operator, the photographer, and the Baltar gunner survive. And then in 419th, Lieutenant Koch, again, his tail gunner is killed. And you'll find actually that tail gunners have the worst survival rate of all the gunners in the B-17. They're set on fire. The fuel tanks in both wings are blazing, but they're able to hold it until everyone's able to get out. But being February over the Alps, two of the crew, the nav and the bombardier, are missing. Their bodies aren't recovered until after the war, high up in the mountains. So they successfully bailed out, only to land in snow, the deep snow-covered mountains. And even wearing all of this very heavy gear, we're unable to survive the elements. So it's a hell of a fight. And this happens because, like Mr. Lockhart mentioned, we don't have the long-range escorts yet. But they push on. 10 planes reach the target. 3 from the 32nd, 4 from the 352nd, again none from the 353rd, and 3 from the 419th. They are there, they encounter moderate, accurate, heavy flak. Some of the planes are damaged, but none to actually go down because of flak damage. This is all fight fighters. we have photos of the actual target. But all the 301st planes with photographers were shot down. So these likely come from the 97th, which was flying in trail on the 301st. It shows good hits on the target. You can see on the image on the left, just the top portion of that airfield oval with the city of Regensburg to the east. And from there, they turn back out of flak, back into the fighters, where lose 2 more planes. Lieutenant Simon's crew, they make it through the bomb run. They're pretty damaged. They peel out about 5 minutes after bombs away, and they're last seen heading down into the clouds. And from there, the story comes from the survivors after the war. They make it down over the northern Adriatic, and they have to ditch. So they make a successful water landing. Everyone survives, but their plane's so badly shot up, their life rafts are, one is completely useless, one only partially inflated. So it leaves these guys with their life vests in the water. Again, this is February. Yeah, it's that far south, but it's still February in the water. They're out there for about 2.5 hours until they're picked up. But in that time, the co-pilot, nav, and bombardier succumb to the elements. And the rest are taken prisoner. Lieutenant Thomas's crew, they have a bit of an adventure. They get hit pretty bad after the target, taking out their number 3 and number 4. Their number 4 prop won't feather, so it's windmilling, meaning there's no chance of them staying with the formation. And probably not even making it home because they try to go for Switzerland. Interestingly, they miss. Because the weather, they miss Switzerland and end up coasting out over Western Italy. They realize where they are after the navigator sees the island of Elba. So they turn south to where they know the Anzio invasion is going on. And they ditch their plane amongst the invasion fleet. And everyone's picked up. Everyone else links up with the fighters and limps their planes back home. Lieutenant Walsh's plane, they don't quite make it home. They do make it back to friendly territory where they're able to make a crash landing with 1 killed aboard. So the true survivors do make it home. And 6 snake wheels down landings back home. There's a breakout. Again, none from the 352nd, only 2 from the 32nd, and 3 from the 352nd, and 1 from the 419th. We have 2 crews that crash land but are recovered. And amongst the folks that get back, there's 3 killed and 7 wounded. None of the aircraft come back unscathed. 5 are severely damaged, and 3 are noted as minor damage. In exchange, it was a gunfight. They claimed 49 kills. There's the breakout. They're only credited with 31 though, with 6 probable and 3 damage. And due to the nature of how all this works, the chaos, and none of this is obviously recorded, this is all word of mouth. Hey, I got this one, someone else may be shooting. There's more than one person shooting at each one of these planes. So even the credited kills are higher than what actually happened. Post-war, we get all the Germans' records, and we discover that for all the 15th Air Force missions that are flown this day, there's 2 against Regensburg, and there's also diversionary attacks in the area. The Germans end up losing 36 planes, just to 15th gunners that day. But in the end, 110 men don't come home. There's 94 seats in there. 110 is almost an entire KC-46 squadron. So it was a rough day. For this, they earned a Distinguished Unit Citation. And instead of reading that, I'll read something that I found this morning. And this is a Silver Star citation for one of the gunners in the 419. So, for Raymond J. Merrick, Staff Sergeant. Reality in action on 25 February 1944. Sergeant Merrick was a tail gunner of B-17 type aircraft on an important bombing mission against an enemy factory in Regensburg, Germany. Sergeant Merrick's aircraft was attacked 7 successive times by formations of over 200 enemy fighters. During these intense attacks, the aircraft was damaged many times by cannon and rocket fire, which resulted in almost complete destruction of the oxygen system, communication system, and badly wounding the waist gunner. Disregarding his personal condition, although bleeding profusely from concussion, which resulted from enemy cannon and rocket fire, Sergeant Merrick stayed at his gun position and gallantly destroyed 4 enemy aircraft, time after time repelling enemy attacks regardless of the fact that he was wounded and almost unconscious from lack of oxygen. By his gallantry and selfless devotion to duty, Sergeant Merrick was upheld in the highest traditions of military service and has reflected great credit upon himself and the armed forces of the United States of America. So, those of us in here who are aircrew have been to the altitude chamber. We've all been hypoxic. And we've only been hypoxic for a couple of minutes, maybe. And I know for myself, when I get there, I'm pretty useless. You know, I get kind of giddy, and my fingers hurt, and I get a bad headache. And that's only after being hypoxic for a couple of minutes. I can't imagine flying a mission, maybe for hours, without oxygen, and having to fight for my life. So these guys put on a hell of a fight, and damn sure earn the reward. But again, this is the ending of Big Week, and let's take a look kind of how it worked. I mean, was it a winning argument? So as Ms. Lockhart said, the goal of Big Week was to knock out the German aircraft industry. There were 16 factories that were targeted. We managed to hit 11 of them. And of those, we reduced 6 of them to greater than 50 or less than 50% output. This means Germans had a bit of a dent in their fighter production. Their goal at the time was about 2,000 fighters per month. And in the 6 weeks from Big Week to the end of March, they had a shortfall of over 2,100. They were not able to regain this goal until June. Additionally, they lost 450 aircraft, both in combat and operational losses, which ended up being 1/3 of their available fighters. Their crew losses were pretty severe too, losing 1/5 of their experienced pilots. In exchange, good guys flew about 6,200 missions and lost about 380 aircraft. You can see the loss percentages and how they're different. The 8th Air Force is flying with long-range fighters. They got the Mustangs. They were taking them all the way to target and back. So they get off pretty easy on about 4%. Even better than the RAF, which is flying at night. 15th, being the smaller Air Force and not the priority, they don't quite have the Mustangs yet, so they suffer a heavier rate, much akin to what the 8th was doing about 6 months prior. But in exchange for this, we start getting actual air superiority. And by the time of the D-Day landings, there's almost no Luftwaffe interference. And post-war interviews, or interrogations actually, with captured Luftwaffe personnel, we realized that they only had 80 operational airplanes in France. But they're cranking out 2,000 planes a month. So there's a little bit of a disparity, so we'll take a look at that. So Big Week was a turning point. It wasn't the knockout, it wasn't the silver bullet, it wasn't a one and done. Much like the planners wanted, we didn't just wipe out their industry in a week. It was much too resilient for that. And also, we had other things to start working on. So we bought ourselves some space. 8th Air Force had to shift over to D-Day prep, taking out infrastructure and transportation targets in France and the Low Countries to make sure the Germans had as hard a time as possible as getting supplies to where we were going to invade. So in 1944 was the highest year of production for the German aircraft industry. They built over 39,000 airframes, more than double what they built 2 years before. But for reasons that we'll touch on, almost none of the planes Germans built in 1944 ever flew, for multiple reasons. One of which is going to be probably the easiest reason. And additionally, we got the Mustangs. They come online in late 43, and by early 44, they're getting to be everywhere. And with a 1,600-mile range, we can go well past Germany with these things. And we also have a shift in tactics. Earlier in the early part of the war, up to late 43, our fighters are riding her in the bombers. It's a very protective, very defensive operation. When the shift comes, as Mr. Lockhart said, the bombers become bait. And we shift into a very offensive posture. With the bombers coming, the Luftwaffe has to come up to fight. We know that, they know that, but we have the better interceptors, better fighters. So we actively send the fighters out to go hunt and kill the Luftwaffe as they're coming up to meet our bombers. And this becomes what we would call now an offensive counter-air campaign. Luftwaffe can't keep up. They've already started slashing their training time. And in fact, some of the units that attacked the 301st on the 25th were training units. By this point, by the end of Big Week, they were already starting to scrape the bottom of their barrel. It's around the clock. We never gave them a chance to really refit and rebuild. And they're also experiencing unsustainable losses, all their experienced crews. And then in April, we start doing something else. While the 8th is busy getting the D-Day beaches nice and soft and cut off, the 15th starts turning off the oil. The Germans' oil industry is very heavily based on synthetics. They have a very complex, ingenious process for turning coal into gasoline. And then when the Soviets capture the last of the remaining oil fields, all they're left with is their synthetics. And by May, due to the attacks we start in April, their demand has already outstripped their supply. And every known plant is hit by the end of July. And it's so effective that Speer writes a letter to Hitler at the end of June saying that the enemy has succeeded in increasing our losses of aviation gasoline up to 90% by June 22nd. In April, they were making about 175,000 tons a month of avgas, and by September it's down to 5. It recovers a little bit by the end of the year, but nothing appreciable. It's also cutting off their flak ammo because their explosives are made from chemicals derived from the synthetic fuels. And the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, seeing Band of Brothers and Bastogne and everything, it fails because the Germans run out of gas. They knew they didn't have enough gas when they started. That's why their main goals were to capture our supply depots, and they run out of gas. And their shortages are becoming so severe that in January of 1945, they cease piston engine fire production, period, and take what little they have left to put into the jets, which doesn't really help. It's too little, too late. But circling back, by the spring of 44, the Luftwaffe is no longer an effective force. They're completely in an unrecoverable descent. They're running out of gas. We're killing all their experience. And a friend of mine I had from the 32nd, he was a 32nd radio operator, got to Foggia in late 44 and flew through the end of the war. And in all of his missions, and he did I think he did his full 50, he said he only saw the Luftwaffe once, and it was a 262 on one of his last missions. So, yeah, Big Week was a big thing. It wasn't the big knockout blow that we planned it to be, but in a roundabout way, it did what it needed to do. It bought us space, bought us some breathing room, and from there, we were able to step off and grind the Luftwaffe into the ground, mainly because they didn't have any gas. Are there any questions? There never are. So this is kind of a soapbox thing for me, this mission, because I've been in 32nd for a long time, and it's the whole forgotten 15th Air Force thing. It's important to bring these stories up, but more importantly, we in the Air Force are kind of terrible at heritage. It's not something that's institutional to us, and it's something that I would hope that would change, and this is something that we can take. Take what their history is our heritage. I'm wearing my Friday patch of the 301st or 305th and the Reich Wreckers. We have people in the 32nd still wearing the same emblem that was painted on jackets that those guys in the Vosges were wearing. The second, they weren't involved in this because they had a very different, very short war, but they would have helped fight in the defense of the Philippines. The sixth, they were hauling food and bully beef in the Pacific. All very important stuff that we just don't really do anything about. And so things we can take away from it, from 305th as a whole, we have 2nd Schweinfurt, and Lawley's fight over Leipzig at the beginning of Big Week. 32nd, we got Regensburg. And for all of us, we can hold Big Week up to the same level as the same equally important pivotal battles as, Iwo for the Marines, Midway for the Navy, and the D-Day landing itself for the Army, which wouldn't have happened the way it did if Big Week hadn't been a success. So, yeah, it's a little bit of soapbox for myself and Mr. Lockhart. But yeah, so summary, here's what we talked about. The disaster, Schweinfurt, how we developed our daylight doctrine, the early experiences with it not working, and realized something had to happen. We had to change our tactics. And then Operation Argument, the development of that, the beginning of it with Lt Lawley in Leipzig. We talked about very briefly about the 301st, then their actions over Regensburg, and then how we won the argument and destroyed the Luftwaffe. And with that, we will turn it to you if you'd like to make some remarks.
So Jeremy and Stu, obviously very well-spoken in our heritage in World War II in that era. But as he was alluding to, we care about our history and our heritage, where we came from, because those are the ones we can go to for that source of inspiration, right? You think about the stories that are told here today and other ones, and the things that those airmen went through, and to still go out there and do it again, and do it again, and do it again, so that you can prep the battlefield for success later on into the future. And really, when you go to Charleston, like we did last year, we'll go back again in 305th this year, and you see the appreciation that the citizens of the United Kingdom have for us and what we did. I mean, you see 305th monuments throughout the town, in the sides of the chapels, in the sidewalks, all over the place. They still remember it. And you hear these stories talking about the airmen and the things they did. They were human beings. They were people that did great things so that we could have our freedom today. So we connect to that heritage so that if the time comes that we have to go forth and put the effort of potentially our lives, our mission, those things on the line, that we have examples of those who did it for the success of our nation, and that we can hold true to the same thing at that time. How do you get back in an airplane? We just saw 10 out of the 12 airplanes formation don't come back. How do you move forward, and how do you mentally prepare yourself to do those things is really what it's all about. How do we connect our heritage to where we are now and what the future may look for us. We may be put in situations like this in the future, and how do we make sure that we're ready to go to be able to accomplish those things. So another round of applause for Stu and Jeremy for taking the time.